head, neck, and respiratory system, which is Lab 2. And we want to start with an overview of the function of this system, because that's going to help us kind of understand why some of the structures look the way that they do, and then also some of the terms for some of the structures that we're going to look at. So the respiratory system is important for exchange of gases. It's going to help bring in oxygen and eliminate carbon dioxide. It's also going to play a role in detection of scents, especially odors that are brought into the nasal cavity that can make contact with the olfactory nerve or cranial nerve 1. So that is going to help in terms of our special senses, which is one of the topics we looked at last week. We also have the movement of air through the vocal cords. We're going to talk about the vocal cords, the larynx, and that's important in voice production. So when we speak, that is really moving air through those folds, which is a really big part of our communication, the nervous system, etc. And then another sort of general function is the division of the respiratory tract. So we have the upper part of the respiratory tract, which is involved in really conduction of air. So warming the air, humidification of the air, removal of particles and so forth. And then when we get down to the lungs, this is where we have the actual exchange of gases. So we can look at a conducting zone versus a respiratory zone when we look at the respiratory tract. All right. So some of the upper respiratory structures, nasal cavity, we have the sinuses that we looked at last week. They help in terms of the head, lightening the head and so forth. The oral cavity is also a part of that upper tract where air can enter the pharynx through either the nasal cavity or oral cavity. And then we move through the larynx, which is where we have voice production at the vocal cords. The trachea, which enters the respiratory tract itself. So the trachea is going to be the cartilaginous wings that lead towards the lungs, and in the lungs we have the actual gas exchange taking place. And if we look more closely at the very distal part of the respiratory tree, the alveoli. And the alveoli are going to be where we have that gas exchange. So this is going to be where we have capillaries that can pick up the oxygen, drop off CO2, and be very, very intimately involved in gas exchange. All right. Let's move on to look at some other structures involved in the oral cavity and then in the neck as well. So the salivary glands, there are 3 of them. They're paired, and they're involved in salivary production, salivary secretion into the oral cavity. The first is the parotid gland. The parotid gland is the largest of the 3. It's found on the lateral aspect of the mandible, below the ear, and related to some of the muscles of mastication that we looked at last week. So for example, the masseter is going to be deep to the parotid gland. Parotid gland is going to be associated with parotid duct, and you can see that duct right here. And that actually enters opposite the upper molar. So the upper molar teeth is where that duct actually enters into the oral cavity. And that is how saliva can be released into these, from the parotid gland into this oral cavity. The other glands are the submandibular, and the submandibular are going to be just beneath and medial to the mandible. Here's the cut surface of the mandible. Notice how it's below, but also somewhat medial or central to the mandible, and that is going to also produce via its duct into the lower part of the oral cavity floor. Similarly, the sublingual salivary gland is going to be under the tongue and have a similar release into the floor. So these are the 3 salivary glands. Again, they're paired and really important in salivary production. And they're, for the most part, they're the same in terms of their function, but we can look more closely at their secretions. And what we'll see is that they have different proportion to their secretions. So we're going to see that some have more mucinous secretions, which is kind of thicker, more viscous, and some have more serous secretion, which is more watery and protein rich. And so that is going to be the difference in the three of them is their proportions in terms of mucinous versus serous secretions. All right. But other than that, they kind of have the same function in terms of salivary production. Let's move on to the oral cavity itself, the oral cavity proper, and look at the lips and some of the features in the oral cavity. So the lips are going to be the flap-like structures that lead from the oral vestibule. These are going to be really important in keeping the oral cavity closed, in bringing food into the oral cavity, in aspects of speaking and articulation, and then also as a tactile organ, especially for infants. So the suckling response is very dependent upon the lips and the attachment and some of the nerve endings and so forth that are found there. And then also facial expression. We're going to have some of the muscles of facial expression like the orbicularis oris being attached to the outer aspect of the oral cavity. And so the lips can help move those muscles and change the shape of the face. We also have the frenula, and the frenula are these appendages that attach the lips to the vestibule, which attaches to the oral cavity itself. So we have the upper frenula, the lower frenula, and then we do also have the lingual frenula, which is attaching the tongue to the floor of the oral cavity, right? So those are attachments that kind of help secure the lips and the teeth. Otherwise, if they weren't as securely attached, when we eat and speak and chew and so forth, these structures would be moving kind of uncontrollably. So this helps to anchor the mouth to the lips, to the oral cavity, to the top of the mouth and the floor of the mouth, respectively. Okay. Moving on to the teeth. So the teeth are another important feature in the oral cavity. These are found within the alveolar processes. So the sockets for the teeth that are found within the mandible and maxilla, so the maxilla above and the mandible below, these sockets are called alveoli. And so the alveoli are where we have the tooth sort of very tightly secured by the gums into the oral cavity. We're going to have different teeth for different functions. So the anterior teeth are going to be called incisors. We have central incisors and lateral incisors, right? So two central incisors, two lateral incisors. Then we have canines. Canines are much sharper. They're usually at the corners of the mouth, above and below. And they're thought to be sort of a primitive set of teeth that have kind of remained evolutionarily. And so they're going to be at the corners, much more pointy or sharpened, and really important in tearing or sharing of food. So the front sets of teeth, the incisors and canines, are really important for biting and tearing, right? For kind of separation of food. The premolars, which are the next set of teeth, so we have two sets of premolars and three sets of molars. The premolars and molars are important for grinding and crushing. And these are going to be towards the back of the mouth, and they're going to help with crushing, grinding, as opposed to the tearing actions of the front teeth, right? So those are our teeth. Typically, our teeth come in two sets. We have a primary set of teeth that come in infancy, and then we have that being gradually replaced throughout puberty by a more mature set of teeth that usually fully come in by the end of puberty. So that is our teeth. Let's move on to the tongue. The tongue is going to be another main occupant of the oral cavity, the floor of the oral cavity. It's made of various skeletal muscles, and then it's anchored to the floor of the cavity by the frenulum, the lingual frenulum. All right. If we think about the tonsils that are related to it, the lingual tonsils are usually found at the base of the tongue. So really towards the very bottom or back of the tongue is where we're going to find the lingual tonsils. And this is one of the four sets of tonsils that actually surround the oral cavity or the oropharynx and the opening to the throat. So we'll talk about the Waldeyer's ring of tonsils. And these are basically aggregates of lymphatic tissue that help to surveil any pathogens and help to mount an immune response for anything that is entering the oral cavity or entering the pharynx from the oral cavity. So we have the palatine tonsils on the lateral aspects of the oral cavity, the lingual tonsils at the base of the tongue, and then the pharyngeal and tubal tonsils are going to be at the top of the pharynx. Moving on to the palate. So the palate is actually divided into two parts. The anterior palate, which is the hard palate or the bony palate. This is made of the maxilla by the palatine shelves, as well as the palatine bones, the paired palatine bones. The hard palate leads towards the soft palate, which is made of muscle and connective tissue. And so the hard palate is a bit more mobile. It's connected to the uvula, which can change its location, as we speak and chew. And that is really the separation from the nasal cavity above and the oral cavity below. So both the hard and soft palate are really important in confining the oral cavity, separating it from the pharynx and from the nasal cavity. We also have the palatoglossal arch, and the palatoglossal arch, there are actually two arches here, palatoglossal and palatopharyngeal, which are both found separating the pharynx from the oral cavity. So this is another structure that helps to change the shape of the oral cavity, change the inlet to the pharynx, and is really important in deglutition. So the process of moving food from the oral cavity to the pharynx gradually as we grind and crush that food, those food particles up, and slowly move them through into the pharynx and eventually into the esophagus. Okay. Okay, so that is a perfect segue into the next region, which is the pharynx. And the pharynx is where we have the pathway that leads down either to the trachea by the laryngopharynx, by the larynx, excuse me, the trachea by the larynx, or the esophagus also by the shared laryngopharynx. So we go from the nasopharynx, which is the posterior aspect of the nasal cavity. That is the direct communication from the septum and the choanae. Remember, the choanae are the openings, and then the septum is the division across the nasal cavity. From the nasopharynx, we can move down into the oropharynx, and the oropharynx is where we have the opening leading from the oral cavity. Here we're going to find the tonsils, including the palatal tonsils, as well as the lingual tonsils at the base of the tongue. We're also going to find the epiglottis here. The epiglottis is helping to secure the larynx and prevent food particles from going into the trachea as opposed to the esophagus. And then below the oropharynx, we have the third division of the pharynx, which is the laryngopharynx. This is also sometimes called the hypopharynx. And this is where we have the cricoid cartilage, the thyroid cartilage, and the larynx in general. The larynx is important in voice production as air moves past the vocal folds. And then as air moves through the larynx, it ends up in the trachea as food moves over the top of the epiglottis. So in order for food to securely move into the esophagus, the epiglottis has to be shut down over the laryngeal inlet, and that prevents us from aspirating food particles into the lungs. So there's a shared opening here at the laryngopharynx, and the epiglottis is what helps to direct food into the right tract, as opposed to air moving into the trachea. Okay, let's move on to look at the rest of the tonsils and the pharyngotympanic tube. Now, we started looking at the pharyngotympanic tube last week when we looked at the ear. So the opening to that tube, the pharyngeal orifice of the pharyngotympanic tube, is where we have the tubal tonsils. So this is the third set of tonsils that are found surrounding the oral cavity and the pharynx. Okay, these are usually called the tubal tonsils or the torus tubarius. Sorry. And then we also have the pharyngeal tonsils. The pharyngeal tonsils are going to be found at the top of the nasopharynx, right, against the wall of the nasopharynx. So we have the pharyngeal, the tubal, the palatine, the lateral walls of the oral cavity, and then the lingual at the base of the tongue, right? So those are the four tonsils that form the Waldeyer's ring or the tubal ring of tonsillar tissue. I also want to point out that the pharyngeal tonsils are also referred to as the adenoids. The adenoid, so that can be an alternate term on your quiz, either pharyngeal or adenal or adenoids. And then same thing for the tubal. The tubal tonsils can also be called the torus tubarius. Okay. Okay, let's move down and look at the larynx. Now, the larynx has several functions. One is for air conduction. It's a part of the conduction system, which is important in bringing air in, warming air, humidifying air, filtering air of any particles. The second function is to help divert food away from the trachea and into the esophagus. So one component of the larynx is the epiglottis, and the epiglottis helps to cover the tracheal inlet. And then the third function, which is probably the most important, is phonation, is speech production, voice production by way of air moving through the laryngeal folds. So these are the folds, the vocal folds, the vestibular folds, and when air moves past these folds, it's going to create these vibrations. And then on top of the vibrations, we have the laryngeal muscles. The laryngeal muscles that help to change the shape of the inlet, and that can change the various qualities of voice. So the pitch of voice, the volume of voice, all of those characteristics can be changed by way of the muscles that are controlling the shape of the vocal folds. Okay. And then we want to look at the cartilages that are involved here. The epiglottis is one. Again, this acts like a flap-like covering over the trachea. The thyroid cartilage, this is another large cartilage that acts as an anchor for the muscles that are involved. So the thyroid cartilage, which is this large front-facing cartilage, this has the laryngeal prominence, also called the Adam's apple. So this is a very characteristic feature, especially in males, the Adam's apple, because of the prominence of the laryngeal prominence of the thyroid cartilage. Next is the cricoid cartilage. So the cricoid cartilage sits between the thyroid cartilage and the first couple rings of the trachea. So where the trachea begins is right beneath the cricoid cartilage and beneath the larynx. So all of this together forms the larynx, and then superiorly, these are going to be attached to the hyoid bone by way of membranes and ligaments, and then anchored by way of some of the strap muscles that I'll talk about later. Okay, so this is important in speech, air conduction, and then controlling the movement of food throughout the larynx. All right. Now, if we look more closely at the internal aspects of the larynx, we have two folds. The vestibular folds, which are called the false folds. Again, these are alternate terms that you may see on your structure list or that you may use on the quiz. So the vestibular folds are false folds because they don't actually help as much in speech production, in phonation. They don't contribute as actively in phonation because they're actually found more lateral to the medial or the lumen of the larynx. Um, Alternatively, inferiorly and more medial are the vocal folds. And the vocal folds are usually called the true folds. These are involved in voice production because they actually are more medial and are intimately involved in vibrations that are important in voice. Okay. So the vocal folds or true folds are below and more medial. The vestibular folds or false folds are above and slightly more lateral or separated. All right. Now, for simplicity's sake, we're only mentioning a few of the laryngeal cartilages, so the epiglottis, thyroid, and cricoid. But I do want to point out there are other cartilages that we're not really speaking about that are covered by the mucosal fold. So all of these other structures here that actually help to maintain the shape of the larynx are also cartilages, the aryepiglottic, cuneiform, corniculate, are other cartilages that are covered over by the mucous membrane of the larynx. And then several other ligaments, as I mentioned, that help to stabilize this structure as well. Okay, let's move on to another important structure in the neck region. This is the thyroid gland. We've talked about the thyroid gland in AMP1 when you look at its function in the endocrine system. It's very important in terms of thyroid hormone production and our overall metabolic function. Now, the thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped gland. It's found at the anterior surface of the neck, and it's usually at the levels of the second through the fourth cartilage rings. So it's going to cover up those first couple of cartilage rings, and it's going to be important in thyroid hormone production, as well as parathyroid hormone production. Remember, the parathyroid glands are also embedded in the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. And so therefore, it's going to be found beneath the larynx. And the importance of knowing the thyroid gland is found here is understanding neck surgery, understanding the airway. Usually if we have an emergency neck surgery, or if we have an emergency airway, let's say someone needs to have their airway, like an emergency airway produced if they're choking on a foreign object, for example, we would need to insert in the cricothyroid ligament to create that false airway. So knowing the anatomy of the thyroid gland is very important. Notice how the thyroid lobe, pyramidal lobe, sometimes extends and covers the cricothyroid ligament, and you could accidentally, injure the thyroid gland while you're doing these procedures, either emergently or surgical procedures that involve the larynx or even the carotid arteries, which are close by as well. All right. So very important to know this anatomy and how it covers up the trachea. Moving down to the trachea itself. So the trachea is the large flexible tube that is made of cartilage and muscle at the back that helps to conduct air from the larynx down towards the bronchi. All right. It's usually about 4 inches long from the larynx down to the bronchi, and then it ends by dividing into the main or primary bronchus, and then eventually leading towards the alveoli. So there's going to be sequential branching of the bronchi to form secondary bronchi, and then tertiary bronchi, and then bronchioles, and then eventually leading towards the alveoli. So that is how air is conducted. Remember, there's no exchange happening just yet. There's just conduction of air from the nasal cavity to the larynx, and then from the larynx down by way of the trachea. Now, posteriorly, there's no cartilage, and in this picture, we can't really appreciate that, but the back of the trachea is actually a strip of smooth muscle called the trachealis. And then the rings that we're seeing here are not continuous rings. They're actually C-shaped rings that are going to go around the anterior surface of the lumen of the trachea, and then the muscle is going to span longitudinally along the back of the trachea. So that is going to make the trachea a little bit flexible at its posterior surface, because remember, the esophagus is right behind the trachea. So in order for the esophagus to expand and accommodate varying volumes of food, we need the back of the trachea to be a little bit more flexible and collapsible in order to accommodate that. And so the wings do not cover the entire surface of the trachea. So here's the esophagus, and notice how it's behind the trachea, but it's not continuous into the thorax and abdomen the way that the esophagus is. So here's the esophagus that goes right through. It's going to pierce the diaphragm at the intervertebral level 8. And then it's going to be continuous to form the stomach. It's going to enter right into the stomach. And so when you think about the esophagus, it's the air, not the airway, sorry, the pathway for food as opposed to air. It's going to be one of the 3 large conduits that go through the diaphragm. So the diaphragm has an opening for the esophagus at the T8 level. It has an opening for the trachea at the T12 level, and then it has an opening for the inferior vena cava at the T10 level. Okay, so these 3 structures are going to pierce the diaphragm and traverse from the thoracic cavity above to the abdominal cavity below. All right, now let's move on to looking at the lungs. So we've talked about some of the accessory structures to respiration and the trachea, bronchi, etc. Now we're actually going to look at the lungs themselves and look at how the lung tissue, the alveoli, are important in gas exchange. So the outer coverings of the lungs are formed by the pleura, and there are 2 layers to the pleura. There's a parietal pleura, which is tightly adhered to the fascia of the thoracic wall. So here are the ribs, and then here is the okay. Here are the ribs. Here are the intercostal muscles. And then here is the fascia, the endothoracic fascia that lines the thoracic cavity. So the parietal pleura is tightly adhered to the thoracic wall by that fascia. And then the visceral layer of the pleura, the visceral pleural layer, is going to be tightly adhered to the lung itself. Now, in between the parietal and the visceral, we're going to have the pleural cavity. So the pleural cavity is the space created between these 2 layers, and it's really a potential space because there's actually a bit of fluid. There's a small thin fluid called the pleural fluid that occupies this space. So there's really not air. There should not be air found in this space because if there is air, that can lead to the collapse of the lung, and that can lead to a positive pressure in the pleural cavity or in this space. So this should be a potential space that has fluid, and that keeps these 2 layers tightly adhered to each other. And if we were to include or introduce air into this space, that would separate these 2 layers, and that would actually result in the collapse of the lung. And that's actually called a pneumothorax, okay? So very important for this structure to maintain its connection, these 2 layers to maintain their connection, for the lungs to remain expanded and to be able to occupy the thoracic cavity and carry out their function. So if we look at the parts of the pleura, we have the costal part, which is attached to the thoracic cavity of the ribs, right? The part of the thoracic cavity where the ribs are found. We have the diaphragmatic part, which attaches to the diaphragmatic part of the thoracic cavity. And then we have the mediastinal pleura that is attached to the medial surface of the lungs, which is the middle mediastinum. So the cervical part of the pleura is the 4th region. That is actually sometimes called the cupula. And this is going to project up into the neck and help to cover the apical parts of the lung, right? The apex of the lung. So I'll go over that one more time. So the mediastinal part in the middle, the diaphragmatic part on the diaphragm, the costal part on the ribs, and then the cervical part up into the cervical region or the neck.